The door was colder than the day, and my breath came out in small clouds. I stood on the front step, holding a little wrapped box in my hands. My phone buzzed, and I read the message again. Mom, don't come this Christmas. The sentence was short and precise. It landed like ice across the porch. For a moment, the house behind me, our house of Sunday dinners and quilts, felt too large, as if rooms had folded and closed. The kettle on the stove seemed to wait, and the radio hummed softer. I smoothed the paper and tied the ribbon because my hands need work when my chest is heavy. I wrapped the chutney jar, the way Walter taught me, folding corners like small prayers. I did not cry out loud. Grief was quiet and steady like a clock. Have you ever been told you're not wanted at the table you always sat at? The question moved through me like a stone across water, leaving small rings of disbelief. I squared the box with a gentle thumb and decided, without fanfare, to give myself a holiday. I breathed, steadying myself. As I tied the ribbon, my grandson's voice rose in my head. Why, Grandma, asterisk, asterisk, hi. I'm Evelyn Hart, and if you know the sound of a kitchen in winter, you're in the right place. This story isn't gossip or drama. It's about dignity and small rebellions, the kind that happen over a stove and a recipe card. I want to tell it straight, because there is honor in naming things true. If you've ever been told to stay away from your own family holiday, tap like and subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear a gentle voice. Sit with me a while. Bring your tea, your knitting, your quiet, because I'm going to tell you how one short text started a little revolution in my kitchen. I'll keep it honest and simple. No shouting, just a woman learning to wrap a holiday for herself and, in the process, finding what matters. Stay with me and listen close. So if you're ready, let's begin. The house wakes before I do. The kettle clicks on at 7 sharp, humming its patient tune while the wood stove gives a soft sigh. The cat, old and striped, circles my slippers like she's tracing memory itself. The smell of cinnamon still lingers from last night's tea. I always start my day the same. Sweep the porch, open one curtain, then two, then three. Little habits that keep time moving, even when nothing else seems to. The house is neat, always has been. Walter used to say you could tell a person's heart by their kitchen table. So I keep mine set with 2 placemats, even though only one gets used. I still fold the second napkin, crisp as a promise. Some people think that's lonely. I think it's respect for what was, and what might still be. There's a rhythm to my mornings. I hum a little, sometimes gospel, sometimes Glenn Miller, while I water the Christmas cactus that refuses to bloom unless I talk to it. I tidy the counter, check the calendar, and make one phone call always to my daughter, Laura. She doesn't always answer, but that's all right. I tell her what the weather's doing anyway. It's snowing here, I'll say, into the voicemail. The kind of snow that hushes everything. Then, I sit by the window with my knitting. The radio fills the quiet with the local morning show. Same host, same cheerful ads, same predictable jokes about the weather. I like predictability. It's a kind of comfort. But lately, the comfort's thinner. The neighbors put up their lights early this year. Big, twinkling ones, the kind that blink like applause. Mine are still in a box under the stairs, waiting for someone to hand me the ladder. Danny, my grandson, used to come help with that. He'd laugh, and I'd tell him to stop leaning too far on the railing. Now he's 20, busy, out in the world. I'll stop by, Grandma, he said last month. I wrote it down on the calendar in green pen. He didn't come, but I haven't erased it yet. I pour my tea, the peppermint kind I save for December. The kettle hisses, the house creaks, and for a few moments, everything sounds alive. But the quiet, that's the thing no one warns you about. It's not peaceful. It's loud. Every clock tick becomes a footstep that doesn't come. Every pipe settling sounds like a voice you almost remember. The phone buzzes once. I smile, thinking maybe Laura's calling back. I wipe my hands on a dish towel, pick it up, and the screen lights up her name. A text bubble, a few lines of gray dot. Mom, don't come this Christmas. Things are complicated. We just need space. This year. Love you. That's it. 3 sentences. My hands go still. The house, once full of small sounds, the kettle, the hum, the ticking, suddenly feels like it's roaring. My ears ring with it. The radio host is still laughing, but it sounds far away. My thumb hovers over the screen, waiting for more. Nothing. The tea goes cold. The cat settles at my feet, waiting for something that won't come. Outside, snow keeps falling quiet, deliberate, like it's trying to cover the sound of breaking. I read the message again, whispering it under my breath, as if hearing it aloud might change it. But words don't shift once they're sent. And in that moment, I feel the strangest thing, not anger, not sadness, but a kind of disbelief, like the floor under a rug has been rolled up when I wasn't looking. I stand still long enough for the window to fog with my breath. Then, I take out the wrapping paper I'd laid aside for Danny's gift. My fingers shake, but they move anyway. The cat watches from the counter as I tie the ribbon with steady hands. The paper crinkles, a small, defiant sound in the quiet. And then I read the text again, once more, slower this time, so it sinks deep where it can't be ignored. Then I read the text. Mom, don't come this Christmas. You know, I didn't grow up with much, but what we had, we shared. Our little town was the kind of place where every porch light meant you could knock if you needed sugar, advice, or comfort. My mother believed that kindness wasn't charity, it was duty. She kept a tin of sugar cookies on the counter just in case someone stopped by with bad news. I met Walter Hart at a church dance. He wasn't the smoothest talker, but he was the kind of man who carried gentleness like it was muscle. He fixed cars for a living, but he treated people like machines worth mending to, patient, steady, deliberate. We danced once, under string lights that flickered when the generator coughed, and I remember thinking, this is a man who won't leave a thing broken if he can help it. He asked if he could walk me home. I said yes. He didn't take my hand right away. Waited until we reached the corner and the gravel gave way to pavement. That small pause was how he lived his life. Careful, respectful, but sure. We married young, 20 and 20-3. Our first Christmas together was in a rented apartment that smelled like paint and new beginnings. We didn't have a tree, so he made one out of chicken wire and tinsel scraps. It leaned a little, but it glowed bright. He said, Evie, a crooked tree still gives light. I never forgot that. We built our life on those small acts, Sunday dinners, passing plates, helping neighbors. We didn't have money for big gestures, so we learned the art of the quiet ones, showing up, fixing what you can, forgiving before bedtime. Walter used to say, a table that's set is a promise. It meant you expected someone, and that expectation itself was love. Years passed, kids came, then grandkids. Life grew busy, but steady. We made things with our hands and believed that doing right by people was its own kind of wealth. I worked at the library, he ran the garage. We volunteered every Thanksgiving, me on mashed potatoes, him fixing broken heaters for free. That was our rhythm. After Walter passed, I kept his routines. I kept setting to plates. I kept the table promise alive, because that's what he'd do. You don't unlearn decency just because the world forgets to mirror it back. Now, standing here, years later, I wonder, when did family stop meaning what it used to? When did holidays become appointments that could be canceled? I suppose people call it boundaries now, but to me it feels like walls, pretty ones, with polite words, but walls all the same. Walter would have hated that message. He'd have said, Evie, go anyway, bring pie. But I can't go. I can't show up where I'm not welcome. So I'll do what I was raised to do. I'll find another way to keep the promise alive, because the table I set, the one Walter built with his hands, isn't just furniture. It's the last standing thing that knows how to hold a family, and I never thought that promise could be taken back with 3 typed words. We built our years like a quilt, bright patches, tight seams, a few worn spots. I worked at the library until retirement. I baked for every fundraiser, volunteered at the quilt drives, made baby blankets for new mothers I barely knew. Folks called me Grandma Eve, even if they weren't kin. I liked that name. It meant warmth, dependability, something you could lean against. Our kids grew up. One moved to the city, one stayed nearby, but busy as the rest. That's the way of it now. Holidays became coordinated, phone calls and polite logistics. Whose turn is it this year? At first, I didn't mind. I thought, they're building their lives. That's what we raised them for. But as years passed, the visits got shorter. The laughter turned into quick recaps, and let's Zoom next week. You can't smell pie through a screen. You can't hug through Wi-Fi. Modern life has its own way of creating silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that feels like waiting for a bus that never comes. Everyone's moving, scrolling, posting, scheduling, but not showing up. Sometimes I'd scroll through photos online. Danny's graduation, Laura's kitchen remodel, a dog I hadn't met. I'd smile, then close the screen before the ache got too sharp. They'd say, we'll come by soon. And I'd nod even though we both knew soon had become another word for maybe. You never see the exact moment the rope frays. It happens in whispers, missed birthdays, forgotten recipes, a text instead of a visit. And by the time you look closely, you're already holding two ends of something that used to be one. Then came the year nobody mentioned Thanksgiving, no call, no plan. I baked the pies anyway. Muscle memory. When no one showed, I wrapped a slice for the mailman and told myself he looked like he needed it. The kitchen still smelled of cinnamon and brown sugar, but it was quiet, so quiet it pressed against my ribs. And when Christmas came, I waited, not for gifts, just a call, a word, anything that said, "You still matter." Instead, the silence stretched until the message arrived, and the day the invitations stopped. That's when the silence turned into a thing I could feel. I wrapped the jar in paper with neat corners, because small rituals keep you steady. The chutney was thick and warm from the last stovetop batch, the one I always made with a clove of ginger and a splash of cider. I wrote Danny's name on the tag in my careful, round letters, and tucked a folded recipe beneath the bow. It felt ridiculous, perhaps, that a jar of jam could carry a conversation. But then what else do you do with words when they have been clipped? I typed a short reply to Laura. "I'm sorry you need space. I love you. If you change your mind, my door is open." I pressed send and it felt like closing a small box. Then I held everything and walked to the mailbox because habit makes courage sometimes. The neighbors passed by in bundled coats. Mr. Keller tipped his hat, the postman waved, and the street smelled faintly of pine from a neighbor's wreath. I slid the parcel into the metal mouth of the mailbox and felt that small clink echo in my chest. It was just a box. It would not fix anything. It might not even be noticed, but I had wrapped something with my hands, and that felt like an offering. Days went by with the slow patience of snowflakes. I checked the porch every time I heard a car. I listened for the keys that meant someone had come to the door. When the return envelope appeared, it was polite and precise. Refused. My name on the postmark looked very small. I stood over it as if I could press the letters back into kindness. I opened the box at the kitchen table where the light was good. The ribbon had loosened in the trip back, and the chutney smelled faintly of cinnamon and late summer apples. My hands trembled a little when I smoothed the cloth over the jar. Inside the box, tucked beneath tissue, I found a small card. It was not from them. It contained a single sentence in handwriting I recognized, and a loop that made my throat ache. "We're keeping things private. Please understand." For a moment I was both furious and bewildered. The card felt like a shield drawn between my hands and theirs. I read it again because repetition is how you try to make sense. I held the paper until it softened at the edges from my fingers. I had always taught my children that hospitality was not a performance but a practice. We baked, we mended, we visited, we kept each other. That card felt like a breaking of a long, quiet promise. That evening I went online because there are places where people's lives show up like postcards. The photos were bright and warm, strings of lights, a tree trimmed with childhood ornaments, laughter caught mid. There was a chair with a ribbon tied to its back. In the bottom corner of the picture, my chutney jar might have sat on a side table. I could see a flash of green in the picture and knew it was mine because I had stitched the label with a small heart. Seeing that seat empty was different than reading the message. The message was a closing. The photo was a proof that a decision had been intentional. The house that I thought I knew could contain something after all. A space where I had been uninvited without a conversation. I set the card on the counter next to the recipe box and made a list of small things to do. Make a new batch. Call my sister. Mend the curtain. Burying the feeling under chores is a skill I learned from long winters. But chores do not always soothe the kind of ache that comes from being kept at the edge of your own life. So I wrapped another jar. I tied the ribbon firmer this time, as if the knot might hold something other than paper. I did it because the returned jar had altered my days, because a refusal is a thing that needs answering, even if the answer is only in steam and sugar. I called Laura until my voice wore thin. I left voicemails that said all the things you say when you are trying to be civil but want to be heard. I love you. I don't understand. If there's anything I did, tell me. The replies were short and careful. Mom, it's family dynamics. We need space. She said it like a practiced recipe, measured and cool. It drew a line I had not seen before. The messages hurt in a way that made my hands cold. I sat with the phone in my lap and felt the weight of everyone's opinions like a draft. People at the grocery store glanced my way and then faced their carts like the world had become awkward for everyone. The chatter at the salon had the odd intimacy of a small town. Did you hear? And they're keeping it private. The phrase "keeping it private" was repeated like a blessing, and I could hear how polite it sounded when it meant exclusion. A woman named Sally at the salon touched my sleeve and said, "We all have to respect boundaries." Evelyn, her voice was soft, which made the words sting more. When did caring become a private currency? When did I become the question mark in someone else's sentence? I told myself not to take gossip as gospel. People talk, people love to fill silences with stories, but the stories hardened into a shape that I could no longer deny. The neighbor who once borrowed sugar now looked at me like I might crack at any moment. Loneliness is not simply being alone. It is being told you do not belong where you always thought you did. I paced the kitchen table and smoothed the cloth with both hands. The house held all the small noises of my life, the radio, the cat, the clock, and each one suddenly sounded like evidence. I tried calling Danny. He picked up and promised to drop by soon, then apologized because a shift at work ran late. His voice was warm but far away. I could hear a sound in the background, laughter or music, and I felt small for wanting to be nearer it. That night, I walked over to Laura's house with a casserole because my hands needed the motion of giving. I left it on the porch. No one came to the door. I stood in the cold with the wind on my face and felt ridiculous and brave at once. The street felt the same as always, but there was an invisible thread that made my steps feel uncertain. If I knocked, would I be turned into a problem? If I left, would they know I had tried? Sometimes courage is waiting for the right moment to step in, and sometimes courage is deciding not to step at all. I sat on the curb until my fingers warmed and then walked home slowly. At the corner, a neighbor nodded and said, "Hope you're okay." I answered in the short way neighbors do. The days that followed were full of little defenses. I kept my calendar full so I would not look at the empty square for December 25th. I took up knitting more seriously, counting stitches until my brain did not argue. But avoidance is a fragile shield. It hides pain for a while and then cracks. In the quiet, I considered what the next step might be. Quiet acceptance would mean conceding a place I had earned by pouring my time and love into one family after another. Speaking up might make things worse. I can be silent, and maybe the wound will close. Or I can act and risk being seen as difficult. I walked to the window and looked at the street where so many feet had passed over the years. I rehearsed how I might walk up and knock. The idea felt both foolish and necessary. I thought of Henry's steady mouth saying, "Stand where you belong." That thought gave my feet a kind of resolve, so I decided to show up, but not the way they expected. I packed the second jar with extra care and a small loaf of gingerbread. The box was smaller, lighter somehow, but the ribbon had a particular neatness to it that I liked. I told myself this was about closure, not confrontation. I would not storm in. I would not demand answers. I would offer the thing I know how to give and then go home. The drive to Laura's street was a ribbon of white and chrome. The houses were lit like little islands. I parked 2 houses down and sat a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, feeling the heat of the rescue blanket in the trunk as if it were a promise. From my vantage, I could see the living room window glowing, people moving inside like shadows on a stage. I walked up quietly and left the gift on the step. The door was answered by a man I did not recognize, polite and clean-shaven, with hands that held a beverage like it was an offering. "Can I help you?" he asked with the sort of courtesy that covers questions you don't want to ask. I smiled because that is what I do when I do not want to let a moment break. "I left this for Laura," I said. My voice was steady. He took the box with slow hands and nodded. "Thank you, Mom," he said. There was a distance in his tone that read like a map. He shut the door with the soft click of someone enclosing a private life. I lingered like a shadow at the fence and watched the living room through the window where the curtains parted. There were string lights, a playlist glowing on a phone, a centerpiece that was not mine and not one I had ever seen before. A ribbon on an empty chair suggested celebration without a guest. A child traced a star ornament with sticky fingers and laughed in that way that makes you ache for the sound. Asterisk. Then I saw it, something I had made sitting quietly on a side table. It was a little wooden bowl I had carved years ago and painted with tiny red berries. I knew every chip, every brushstroke. Seeing it there, used by someone else, felt like being shown a photograph of myself as I once was and told I could not be invited back into it. The man who answered the door waved at me through the glass, as if signaling, "Everything's fine." His hospitality felt practiced. Perhaps he was kind, perhaps he was polite, perhaps he was the sort of helper you call when you want someone to perform warmth while keeping distance intact. I turned away after a slow minute and walked back to the car. The night air hit my face like honest weather. I breathed hard and felt the ache settle into something firmer. Resolve. People rearrange tables all the time. They do it without malice sometimes, but it still changes the space you once knew. I drove home under streetlights that made the snow look like river glass. I did not sleep well that night. I thought about the bowl and the way the light had caught its edge. I thought about the polite man on the porch and the way his manners shaped the night. There is a kind of grief that comes not from losing things, but from being led to notice they are no longer yours. Asterisk morning found me at the sink, hands in warm water, loosening the ache with steam. I made a new list. Call the pastor. Ask about the community dinner. Find a way to be present without pleading. The list made me feel a little steadier. I chose action over pity. I left the house with my knitting in my bag and the second jar in the back seat, which felt oddly like a small flag. I walked the sidewalks with a slow, deliberate step. The world kept turning and the snow kept falling. Some things change and some things remain. You can watch and hope, or you can step forward and do the next honest thing. And then I saw through the living room windows something I had made, being used by someone else. Sunday at church should have been simple. The organ warmed, people shuffled hymnals, and the light through the stained glass painted the pews in color. I went because that is what we did on Sundays, a habit of faith and neighbors. But there is a certain clarity in a place of worship that makes private things larger and public things smaller. The whispers found me like a slow draft. Did you hear? It's a family thing. There, keeping it private. Faces I'd known for decades bent in half smiles that didn't reach their eyes. It felt oddly theatrical, like everyone knew their part except me. I kept my head bowed and tried to sing the words because the hymns are a place where the heart can steady itself after service. Cousin June came up close, as if we had a personal history that required immediate patching. She took my hand, but didn't squeeze. "Evelyn," she said, "we're protecting someone. You need to understand." Her voice had the pity of someone uncomfortable with the work of care. Protecting someone from what? I wondered. From me. From a truth that might make them look small. I felt my face flush. Protecting whom? I asked, but the question landed like a pebble in a well. June's glance slid to the ground. "It's complicated. We don't want to put pressure on her." The pronoun floated between us like smoke. The idea that you might be the source of pressure is an odd thing to hear. I had spent my life making space for others, and suddenly that very generosity was framed as an intrusion. It turned me inward in a way that made my bones ache. I wanted to speak, to tell them all the small things I had done. But I also knew that listing kindnesses sounds defensive when held up in public. Defensiveness rarely wins hearts. The pastor found me afterward, and his voice was low and steady. "Evelyn," he said, "we might need your help with the community dinner. People are struggling." The invitation felt wrapped in a question. Was this charity or a test? Help him out of kindness, or help him to show them the truth of you? The envelope he gave me had a letterhead thanking volunteers and a sign-up sheet with dates. It was mundane, but the offering felt like a scaffold, a way to build presence without storming a family's closed door. I sat on the church steps and read the sheet until the words blurred. The parishioners passed and said, "Good to see you," like they were extending small lifelines. When did a helping hand become a way to prove you belong? I thought about the dinner, about Henry teaching me to make the perfect gravy, about how he loved the way our small town stitched people together. If no family table would seat me, perhaps a different table might. Perhaps a table for the town could hold more in our city of small hurts. Still, the idea of stepping into a public role while my own house felt like a place of exile frightened me. Pride and pain are close kin. The thought of my daughter hearing I'd taken the pot roast to a public event instead of her kitchen made me want to both laugh and cry. But I also felt an ember of something else. Possibility. A chance to do the work I love and to be seen as myself, not as gossip. June's warning echoed in my head. Protecting someone. It sounded like code for keep the peace. But peace at the cost of truth is often brittle. I folded the sheet and put it carefully into my handbag like a map. I made a plan in small steps. Sign up to cook, call the pastor to volunteer, and go where people needed help. I would not beg at their table. I would build a new way to be present. Then the pastor came up to me with an envelope and said, "We might need your help this Christmas." The flyer was a slip of paper, nothing more. It had red print and a list of needs: food, volunteers, drivers. It asked for people to sign up by Friday. I folded it until the creases lined up like a town's small plea. Henry would have said, They need hands. Go give them. He liked the idea of work as love, a way to show you cared without making speeches. For a long time I had kept his apron in the attic. A folded, denim map of our years. I took it down and smelled the faint grease of years gone by and felt something settle into my chest. The deadline felt close enough to touch. Time, always merciless, gives you the shape of events whether you want them or not. I opened the recipe box. Old slips of paper, browned at the edges, tumbled out like confessions. There was Henry's handwriting on one. A small scrawl about roast times and the ratio for gravy. The sight of his curling hand made something in me ease. He was gone, but his instructions were stubbornly practical. I read the note twice and laughed because the world was strange enough to place him in my lap at just the moment. I needed a nudge. Signing up felt like a decision. I could keep my hands busy with mending and memory, or I could set a new table where perhaps others would find a place. Henry's voice whispered, "Do it for the ones who have no other place to sit." I imagined a room full of people who needed a hot plate and a listening ear. I imagined Danny's face when he saw me there, not begging but serving. There was pressure. Someone might read my name on the sign-up sheet and call my daughter. Someone might gossip. There would be eyes and questions. My gestures might be misread as a challenge, but there is, in running yourself towards service, a kind of armor. You are busy doing something useful, and the need covers a multitude of discomforts. The potluck sign-up had a slot that read, "Main dish donation." I underlined it with a shaky hand. I picked out a menu: roast, gravy, following Henry's note, carrots and buttery potatoes. I planned chutney, of course, because a little sweetness cuts through heavy meals. I thought of the way people gather around food and how plates can do what words sometimes fail to do. They bring warmth. But the deadline tightened like a thread at my throat. I wrote the date on a sticky note and put it on the fridge. I dialed the pastor and said, "I can help. I'll bring the main dish." He was grateful and then practical, offering a time and a list of needs. We hung up with smell agreements and larger relief. The plan took shape. There is always a decision point where you choose the life you will live next. For me, it was the sign-up sheet, the pen, and the memory of Henry's careful hand. I would set a new table if the old one refused me. Maybe the town would welcome me. Maybe they would not. Either way, I would be doing what I knew how to do, turning ingredients into sustenance and loneliness into company. I opened the recipe box, and the paper that fell into my lap was his handwriting. I laid the quilt out on the dining table and let it breathe. Light from the window fell across the squares like a slow hand, highlighting seams and stories. Each patch told a little life. Walter's collar from a shirt he wore to town meetings, a scrap from my daughter's first dress, a blue square that had once been Danny's blanket. I ran my fingers over the stitches and felt time move under my palm. The work changed me. Where silence had been a hollow, the quilt became a voice. For the first time in months, I felt more than the ache of being left out. I felt a plan, quiet as a prayer. Making the quilt stopped being about winning a ribbon. It became a way to hold our family in one place when the world felt like it was sorting us into different boxes. Neighbors stopped by with cups of coffee and offers. Martha brought pins and a grin. "You're making something true, Evie," she said, handing me a needle. I thanked her and kept sewing. The rhythm steadied Mitha up. The pull, the small knot that secured a memory into cloth. Walter would have liked the way the squares fit together. I stitched late into the night. The house listened and kept its breath small and steady. I told the quilt things I hadn't said aloud about the nights I stayed up waiting for a call, about the time I mended Danny's sleeve after he got his first job, about forgiving even when I hadn't been forgiven. Each confession was a tiny thread, and each thread held. When I sewed the square with Danny's tiny blanket into the center, I felt a little tremor run through me. It was not only about him, it was about the years that make children strangers to the hands that raised them. The center became a small pulpit. Around it I placed a pocket for a letter, a place to tuck words I might not say. I wrote a simple note and slid it into that pocket. "I was here. I am proud of you." The quilt was not a protest so much as a record. It told of Sunday dinners and first dates and the hospital room where Walter took my hand and hummed until dawn. It carried stains of jam and the faint, ghost smell of cologne from boys who outgrew our laps. It hung memory like a shawl, and in doing so asked people to remember. At the midpoint of my work, I realized something that steadied my hands. I could not wait for invitations to make me seen. I could make myself visible on my own terms. That felt like courage. It felt like rebellion in a very small room. The town hall smelled of varnish and lemon oil when I carried my work in for judging. I walked with it like it was a child needing reassurance. People's eyes lifted as I passed. Some recognized my name, some recognized Walter's, a few nodded. The way small towns do when they find the edges of a story they already half know. The day after I pinned the final edge, I went to the community center and signed up to lead a cooking session for the town dinner. Preparing to cook for the public felt different than baking for a church bake sale. This time my work would be public, hands visible, a kind of answer to a silence. I measured sugar and folded pastry and felt the steadying hum of purpose. I wanted to feed people, to stitch ordinary lives back together with warm plates. I taught recipes like prayers, how to thicken gravy without lumps, why to brown the onions slow, where to tuck a cinnamon stick so people would find a small comfort in each bite. Folks leaned in to watch and asked questions as if there had always been an open seat for me. Plates were boxed and labeled, and a woman who had been lonely came forward and took her meal with tears in her eyes. I felt the ache lighten a little, but the world has an odd way of testing new resolve. The next morning I walked by the community center and noticed the bulletin board where volunteers signed up. The staple marks were there, the tacks were in place, but the sign-up sheet itself was gone, neatly removed. Perhaps it had been taken down by mistake. Perhaps someone thought to replace it. But the spaces left empty have meaning. They are little decisions that say who is included and who is not. The missing paper felt like a small erasure. It made me wonder who would unwrite a plan to feed people, and why. The thought settled in my chest like a shard of ice. I took the kettle home and let its steam fog the window as I tried to press the day back into order. For the first time since I had decided to be visible on my own terms, I worried that visibility attracts not only warmth but also the kind of quiet judgment that can make you small again. I folded a napkin and put it on the counter. I wondered who had taken the sheet, and why. I wondered who would decide we could not gather, and what that would mean for the people who needed a warm plate, for the ones whose dinners are not guaranteed by a calendar. I wondered whether being seen meant more exposure, or a chance to be useful at last. I chose the latter. I thought of Henry's steady hands and his habit of getting the pots on the stove when there was work to do. I thought of the town and the people who would sit down hungry if we did not answer. So I set the pans and lit the oven again. But the night before the dinner, someone took the sign-up sheet off the board. Word spread quickly, because small towns spin stories like quilts. I tried to be steady, but steady can look stubborn when the lens is small and close. My daughter called that afternoon, voice tight and quick. "Mom," she said, "I heard you signed up to run the town dinner. Why would you do that without telling us?" Her words landed like an accusation and a plea wrapped together. I answered as calmly as I could. I signed up because people need food and hands to serve it. She barked a laugh that sounded nearly like a sob. "You're making this about yourself. Don't turn this into grandstanding." The phrase hurt me because I had never thought of serving as a stage. I felt the sting of being misread by the person who knew me best. There are costs to choosing to be visible. Sometimes being seen means you are vulnerable to being labeled loud or dramatic. I thought of Walter in his quiet life of service, and how he would never call helping a spectacle. I tried to explain my choice, to be useful in a public way, so that those without kitchens would not go hungry. She did not accept that explanation easily. "People talk, Mom," she said. "They'll say you're trying to humiliate us. You'll make things worse." I told her I did not want to humiliate anyone. I wanted to offer dinner to the town. The call ended in a long, aching silence. I sat in my kitchen and watched the steam rise from a pot and thought about what it meant to step into the light. Doing the right thing is not always the comfortable thing. It requires you to risk patience and to bear speculation from those you love. I made the plan anyway because I was tired of living at the edge of my days, waiting for permission to exist fully. The town meeting that night tightened my resolve. Some suggested I might be airing family matters and that I should step back. I stood and listened to the whispers and then asked for the microphone. My voice felt small, but it was steady. "I will cook because people need warm plates and company," I said, plain and without drama. There are moments when truth is simple and needs no dressing. A few people nodded, and a hand went up to offer help with transportation. Martha patted my shoulder in a way that felt like agreement, and later that week she dropped by with a thermos. I could have retreated, apologized, and kept the peace. But peace at the price of my dignity was not peace I could live with. I baked a pie and placed it on the windowsill, the sugar crust catching the afternoon light. I felt the cost of my choice like a weight that was also a lantern. Being present would not solve every hurt, but absence had already done more harm than I could count. So I kept my plan intact and prepared to carry its cost. I wrote down tasks and checked them twice: potatoes, gravy, pies, extra chair's end, called the pastor to confirm times. I woke early the morning of the dinner and tied my apron with hands that had stitched for decades. I felt tired but brave in a way that had nothing to do with showmanship. The volunteers hummed as they worked, and I felt the old joy in small, steady stitches. And on the morning of the dinner, my daughter did the one thing I didn't expect. Tension in a small town is a peculiar thing. It moves like weather. The day of the dinner, clouds rolled in and the forecast said flurries, which makes everything feel urgent. Volunteers arrived with good hearts and different ideas about how to arrange the room. Someone wanted to seat families by last name. Someone else thought tags with notes would be warmer. A rumor had started online about family tensions and people whispered into their phones like a secret service. I was called into a brief meeting where a woman suggested I keep family affairs private for the sake of peace. I looked at her and felt my teeth tighten. Peace that silences is not peace I can accept. Danny showed up mid-afternoon, clutching a stack of folding chairs and apologizing without being asked. He moved like a man trying on apology, awkward and earnest, and his presence warmed the room. He helped set tables and fill thermoses while stealing glances at me like he was rehearsing a conversation. At one point he said softly, "Grandma, I should have called more." "I'm sorry," I said. "Thank you for coming." The weather turned sharp and a few volunteers had trouble arriving, but those who stayed worked harder to fill gaps. A neighbor brought extra blankets. Someone plowed the church driveway without asking for thanks. The work of a town is often unseen until something breaks, and then everyone remembers the small jobs matter. Social media breathed rumor into the day, and a few unkind comments curled like cigarette smoke. Still, people lined plates and carried them out to cars for the housebound, and the small acts collected into dignity. I found myself laughing with a woman whose daughter I had taught to sew. The sound felt like mending. The pastor made a small speech about community and responsibility, and people listened in a way that surprised me. At one point, a young man stood to say something unkind about airing private matters online, and murmurs ticked around like loose string. I asked for the microphone because it felt right to speak with hands that had done more than talk. "We are here to feed our neighbors. That is the work of love," I said plainly. And people applauded. My daughter stood near the back, arms folded, and I could see worry etched deeply at her temples. Still, I did not demand her forgiveness, only the chance to be useful in the public way. A small town knows how to mean it. Danny worked beside me, carrying plates out with care as if lifting a vow. By the time the first cars lined up to receive meals, the air tasted like stew and cedar and the soft noise of kindness. The day did not erase weeks of hurt, but it made a space where repair could begin. People offered help, some with awkwardness, some with sincere hands. Each plate handed over carried a quiet apology and a tiny blessing. I answered questions from volunteers about how long to bake potatoes and when to stir the gravy, telling them the same truths Walter had taught me. My fingers felt honest and useful in ways letters on a screen had failed to be. Asterisk, asterisk. When the plates were finally set and the first round had gone out, the room quieted with a sort of satisfied fatigue. It was then that the pastor called everyone to a small circle and invited those who wished to speak. I stepped forward not to accuse but to remind us all that community is practical, not rhetorical. Then, just as the first plates were set, my daughter walked in and sat down at the table. The hall smelled of roast and pine, and the kind of coffee that tastes better because it's shared. I sat near the end of a table, hands folded in my lap, listening to people trade small stories. For a while the conversation was ordinary and warm, and the kind of gentle chatter that feeds the spirit. Then my daughter rose, and the room turned toward her like a stage, shifting its light. She did not speak kindly. "This is not about you, Mom," she said, voice sharp and deliberate. "You made a spectacle, and it felt like a performance." The words hit like a fist in a room that had been holding its breath. I felt every year of being a mother compressed into a single, raw moment. Her eyes flashed with a mix of hurt and protectiveness and something like accusation. I could have answered with a list of dishes and seam repairs and nights slept on couch cushions, but lists sound defensive. Instead, I tried to keep my voice even and said, "I did this for the people who needed a warm plate." Her face reddened and some in the room shifted uncomfortably. Those who had come for food watched as If witnessing a private quarrel spilled into public air, I considered leaving. For a heartbeat, the thought of stepping out into the snow felt like relief. But the hush that followed was not an absence of witnesses. It was a town listening. A neighbor I had once helped with a car loan stood and said softly, "Evie fed my mother when she had no one." Another woman cleared her throat and said, "She mends a lot more than clothes around here." Small voices rose with small memories that held weight. People remembered the casseroles, the blankets, the quilts left on porches for those who could not afford heat. Those memories created a web that would not let my daughter's words be the last line. In public places, private hurts are complicated, but community memory has a way of answering. Neighbors who had been silent earlier now spoke up, not to shame my daughter but to offer context. The pastor folded his hands and said, "We must be kind and also honest." A woman from the library mentioned a time I had taught her son to tie a knot, which drew a ripple of laughter. The room softened around those recollections like bread soaking up gravy. I realized then that my hurt was seen, which is a strange and humbling thing. I had prepared to be small and invisible, and instead the town offered witness. My daughter's face changed as she looked from me to the circle of neighbors and saw that she was not alone in her feelings. She sat down and tears came without dramatic speeches, only quiet and human sound. I stood frozen for a long beat, hand on the doorknob like it was a slippery truth. The thought of leaving felt tempting because retreat spares you the sting of further argument, but leaving would hand the story to silence, and silence favors those who close doors. I thought of the elderly man who hugged me just yesterday and said, "Miss Evie, you make the best stew." I thought of the woman who told me quietly that my pie was the first real meal she'd had in weeks. Those small testimonies felt like pebbles in my pocket. They weighed me down in a way that held me steady. The room's murmurs grew into a soft support that reminded me I was not performing but serving. I breathed in and let the warmth of that truth anchor me. And just when I thought I would leave, Danny stood and did something I had only dreamed of. Danny's hands trembled the first time he reached for the microphone. He was not one for speeches, just a man with a good heart and a willingness to try. "I don't have many words," he began, and the room leaned in, as if remembering how to listen. "But my grandmother has fed me my whole life. She held my scraped knees and kept my secrets." He spoke of small things: mending a chain, leaving cookies on the porch, sitting up late during finals end. His words were humble and true. Then he asked the crowd to do something small and simple: applaud my name for the years she quietly showed up. The applause was not theatrical. It was steady and honest and felt like a town making space for one of its own. My daughter wept quietly, folds of regret softening her face. Neighbors came forward with quick stories: Mrs. Alvarez about the quilts, Mr. Keller about the time I fixed his shed roof, a teen about a sandwich I once handed him when his lunch had been stolen, a neighbor offered to help with the dishes, and a young man I didn't know folded chairs with surprising care. The pastor whispered thanks and said the meal had been a model of what we could do when we chose community. I felt small and radiant at once, like a candle passing its light to another wick. It was a simple victory for ordinary life, and I took it where it belonged: into the kitchen, into the hands that needed warm plates. After the formal words, people stayed to wash, to chat, to mend a sleeve or tell a story. I stood at the sink and accepted help with the dishes, and it felt like the town was helping me stitch a hymn that had worn thin. Hands that had once borrowed sugar now returned casseroles and conversations. Danny stayed for an hour, then two, and for the first time in months we ate together in a way that felt steady and true. My daughter came by later with a small apology and a pie she'd made herself. Not because I demanded it, but because she chose to bridge the gap. The work that night was Pete smoked ham pies, and the repair was practical too, a slow gathering of ordinary gestures. I understood then that dignity is restored not in grand pronouncements but in steady acts: a call, a visit, a pie on the windowsill. The evening wound down with the dimming of lights and the sound of chairs scraping softly on the gym floor. I wiped a counter and breathed in the smell of soap and roasted meat, and something like relief. People left with polite goodbyes and promises to check in on neighbors during winter storms. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the fridge and the clink of a final spoon being set aside. I closed the cupboard doors and reached for my coat, thinking the night had given me what I had needed most: presence. I felt grateful. The room was full, the kind of full that makes your heart expand and ache at once. Plates clattered, forks chimed, the murmur of conversation rolled through the hall like a hymn. The smell of roast, cinnamon, and hope filled the air. I stood near the back, hands folded over my apron, watching people I'd known my whole life sit elbow to elbow again, not perfect, but together. Asterisk asterisk. The pastor tapped a spoon against his glass. Friends, he said, his voice kind but steady, we have a moment before dessert. He looked out across the tables. Tonight's dinner wouldn't have happened without someone who stepped forward when others stepped back. People turned their heads, some smiled, some looked toward the kitchen. He continued, this year, the council wants to honor Mrs. Evelyn Hart for what she's done, for showing us that one person's steady hand can hold an entire season together. Applause began softly, then built, real applause, not polite. I felt my throat tighten. My knees went weak. I hadn't expected it. I had only come to serve. Martha from the quilting club stood up and said, you saved Christmas for this town. Evie, you remind us that it isn't about invitations, it's about inclusion. Laughter and cheers rippled through the room. Someone whistled. Someone clapped until their palms must have stung. The sound pressed against my chest in a way that was both tender and unbearable. And then I saw Laura. She was still standing near the door, coat half on, eyes glistening like she was holding her breath. She didn't speak at first, just walked forward slowly, her heels clicking soft as apologies. When she reached me, she didn't say a word. She just opened her arms, not wide, not confident, but trembling, tentative. I hesitated for a moment. Then, I stepped into the space between us. Her shoulder fit against mine like memory, and I felt the small hitch of her sob. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know, I said. Me too. The crowd didn't interrupt, they didn't cheer, they just let it happen to women, mother and daughter, quietly finding their way back through years of pride and misunderstanding. The applause that came after was small, almost reverent. It wasn't for the meal anymore, it was for the moment. Someone from the council table, a woman in a red scarf, raised her hand and said, I'd like to nominate Evelyn Hart for the Heart of Christmas Award this year. Gasps and laughter followed. Oh heavens, I muttered, cheeks burning, that's too much. But inside, a warm, shaking gratitude bloomed, not because of a plaque or a title, but because in that small-town gymnasium, beneath the buzz of old fluorescent lights, I finally felt something I hadn't felt in months. Belonging. Asterisk. Danny stood beside us and rested a hand on my shoulder. You did it, Grandma, he said softly. You really did. No, I smiled, looking around the room at the crowd, the leftovers, the little messes that meant life. We did. As the evening wound down, neighbors lingered, reluctant to leave warmth for cold streets. I collected plates, folded chairs, and hummed under my breath the song Walter used to sing while washing dishes. We'll meet again, he'd hum. Don't know where, don't know when. For a moment, I could almost feel his hand on mine, steadying me, saying, you see, Evie, you kept the promise. You set the table. When I stepped outside, snow was falling, slow and forgiving. I drove home through quiet streets, each house glowing like a small story. When I reached my porch, the air felt lighter. The old porch light hummed softly, welcoming me back. And then, I saw a note taped to my doorframe, edges curled from the cold. My name was written in Laura's handwriting. The note on my door simply said, thank you for not giving up on me. Love, Laura. No explanations, no extra words, just enough. I pressed it to my chest, then pinned it to the fridge, where Walter's old recipe cards used to hang. In the days that followed, life began to move again, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet way a house starts to hum when it's loved. The phone rang on Tuesday. It was Laura, her voice softer this time. I'm trying to make your stuffing recipe, she said. Is it 2 eggs or 3? Depends how fluffy you want it, I answered, smiling. We laughed, and for the first time in a long while, the sound didn't ache. Danny stopped by that weekend, carrying a loaf of bakery bread and an armful of energy. Grandma, he said, I'm staying for breakfast. He made coffee too strong and eggs too soft, but I didn't correct him. We sat at the kitchen table, sunlight catching in the steam between us. Next time, he said, we'll make the chutney together. Neighbors started knocking again, to return dishes, to borrow sugar, to ask advice about pie crust. The world seemed to remember how to talk across fences. I taught a baking corner at the library every Thursday, a half-dozen teenagers, all elbows and laughter, learning how to make cinnamon rolls that didn't deflate. They called me Miss Evie, which made me laugh every time. Teaching them gave me back something I hadn't realized I'd missed. purpose. When they burned the first batch, I told them, even mistakes can smell good if they are made with care. In January, I began waking to the soft tick of the clock, the kettle's hiss, the scrape of snow shovels outside, and those little sounds that once felt like reminders of loss now sounded like home again. The loneliness hadn't vanished. It had simply changed shape. It had softened into space, space for gratitude, for quiet pride, for peace. Then one afternoon, while folding laundry and humming along to the radio, I noticed an envelope on the doormat. My name, written in blue ink, the handwriting formal. Inside, a short letter from the mayor's office. Dear Mrs. Hart, you have been selected as this year's recipient of the Heart of Christmas recognition for outstanding service to the community. Please join us at the February ceremony. With gratitude, the town council. I sat down at the kitchen table, holding the paper like it might flutter away. My breath came shallow, like laughter caught mid-bloom. I looked out the window at the snow, melting into slush, and thought of Walter, of my daughter, of everyone who had sat at that table, and of how, even after all the quiet heartbreak, I still belonged here. I've learned something about growing older. It's not about fading out. It's about learning to glow quietly. For a long time, I thought invisibility was just a fact of aging, that one day you simply become background to other people's stories. But I was wrong. You don't disappear unless you let yourself. Life keeps inviting us to participate, even when the invitation doesn't arrive. You can make your own. That's what this Christmas taught me. You can be excluded from a table and still find a way to serve a meal. You can be told, don't come, and still show up for life with your hands, your craft, your heart. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means folding pain into something you can carry without bitterness. It means looking at the people who hurt you and deciding not to hand them the pen that writes your ending. If you're listening to this, maybe you've been told you're too much or not enough. Maybe someone stopped calling, or you're waiting for a knock that never comes. Let me tell you something I learned the hard way. You are still part of the story, especially if it feels like you're not. Make soup for someone. Write a card you don't expect to be answered. Set a chair, even if no one sits in it. The act of readiness is its own kind of love. For me, dignity came back not through an apology, but through motion, through showing up, through feeding, through creating. You don't have to prove your worth with speeches. Just live it in the open, gently, and without apology. Because community isn't built by perfect people. It's built by people who keep showing up, casseroles in hand, forgiveness in heart, aprons still dusted with flour. If I could go back to that first morning, holding the phone with the message that broke me, I wouldn't change a word of what followed. Because in losing the invitation, I found my courage. And courage, quiet, ordinary, kitchen table courage, is the most human thing there is. So, to you listening, I'll say this. Don't wait for permission to be part of your own life. If your voice shakes, speak anyway. If your hands tremble, bake anyway. If your heart aches, love anyway. And maybe, just maybe, the small thing you do today will be the gift someone remembers tomorrow. The next morning, I logged on to read the comments on this very story. Sometimes, the words that come back to you are their own kind of prayer. Reminds me of my mom, calling her tonight. We set an extra chair this year just in case. I'm bringing my grandma to our town dinner because of this. Crying in my kitchen, thank you for reminding me to forgive. Each one felt like a small light in a long hallway. Then came others, photos of family recipes, folded letters, new traditions. One woman wrote, my daughter and I made your chutney today. We laughed more than we cried. I smiled, imagining those kitchens, the clatter of spoons, the sound of laughter echoing off tile. Stories really do travel. They move from one home to another, stitching people together who've never met. As I scrolled, I saw one comment that made me stop. Evie, it's Martha. You still owe me that quilt pattern. I laughed out loud. Old friends, new voices, strangers becoming neighbors again. Spring arrived slow and tender. The snow melted off the gutters, and the town smelled like wet earth and promise. I started a Sunday potluck at my house. Nothing fancy, just casseroles, laughter, and mismatched chairs. We called it Soup and Stories. Folks brought soup, I provided pie, and somehow every story found a home between bites. At the library, the kids asked if we could start a youth baking night. So we did. Flour everywhere, laughter everywhere. I taught them how to roll dough thin enough to see sunlight through it, the way Walter used to. One afternoon, I opened my mail to find photos from Laura, her, and Danny at their own dinner table, candles glowing, my old table runner stretched across it. The note read, "Thank you, Mom, for setting the table, even when we didn't deserve a seat." I sat in my quiet kitchen, tea cooling beside me, and felt a peace that didn't depend on anyone's permission. I wasn't the center of everything anymore, but I was included, and that was enough. Thank you for spending time with me today. If this story stirred a memory, tell me about a tradition or a small ritual you'll never give up, even if no one else remembers it. Your story might just remind someone to make that call, bake that pie, or open that door. And if you'd like to join me again, next Sunday's story is The Quilt That Brought the Town Together, dedicated to the hands that feed us and the hearts that forgive.